we're gonna go into polyvagal mapping. Now, if you have worked with me in some capacity with polyvagal mapping before, you are more than welcome to do this practice again, as it's self-discovery. There's always more you can learn. So you're going to need a piece of paper and a writing instrument. So please pause this video and retrieve a piece of paper and a marker, pen, pencil, whatever you need. So once you have your supplies and a nice firm surface to write on, you're going to take that piece of paper horizontally, okay? And you're going to separate it into 3 sections. So you're going to draw 2 lines across that paper, so you have 3 distinct sections, okay? The first section, I want you to write ventral somewhere at the top of that section. So ventral, V-E-N-T-R-A-L, ventral. The next thing I want you to put in the second slot is sympathetic. So you might have heard of sympathetic, like fight or flight. So put down sympathetic. And then in the third section, I want you to put dorsal, D-O-R-S-A-L. So now you've got 3 sections: ventral, sympathetic, and dorsal. So we're going to start to examine these 3 states, okay? So you are welcome to write notes in these sections, right? Get engaged, get involved. You're getting some of your body involved here as well, right? You're literally putting pen to paper. So in ventral state, this is where we feel most connected to others. This is our physiological safety. This is where communication is easier. We feel more relaxed. We feel really safe and comfortable in the company of others. Curiosity is here. Play is here. Ease is here. Currently, I would say I am more in a ventral state right now. I'm kind of trying to connect to those that I'm speaking to. I'm feeling pleasant. In this ventral state, I also want you to write down parasympathetic. Okay, so somewhere in that section, write parasympathetic. This is part of your parasympathetic branch, and we'll go a little bit more detail into that as we move through these sections, but for now, just write down parasympathetic. So I want you to think about times in your life, maybe recently, maybe today, maybe yesterday, where you might have been dominant in a ventral state, where play was easy, where you felt curious, where you felt really connected. And I want you to maybe write down that particular instance. So playing with my kids last Saturday. So what we're doing here is we're gathering information of when you were in that ventral state, when you've experienced physiological safety. For some people, this can be really tricky. Physiological safety and feelings of connection and at ease might be hard for you to remember, hard to access, and that's okay. If you can't think of anything to put under ventral, then that's okay. But that's what we're going to start to work on doing, is trying to compile more data here of when am I in ventral state? What happens when I'm in ventral state? How do I feel in my body? How am I responding to my environment? So you're always welcome to pause this video at any point to dive a little bit deeper and take a minute to really explore some of the concepts I'm talking about. So if you want to work particularly in that ventral state and really try to think, oh, when am I in this ventral state? Feel free to pause the video, but I'm going to move on to the next state. So the next state is a sympathetic state. So sympathetic is typically seen as fight or flight. right? So when I gave the example of somebody jumping out in front of you, typically that fight or flight will go off in people, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna defend myself. Sympathetic doesn't always necessarily mean you're gonna fight. You can derive some sympathetic charge when you're exercising, right? You're gonna need some of that energy. It's literal mobilization. So if you want to write that word next to sympathetic, you can write mobilization. It's a literal state of mobilizing. You're either fighting or you're fleeing. So for the context of this practice, we're going to look at events in your life where you have been in a sympathetic fight or flight experience where you were more in a protective state, right? So again, sympathetic can be correlated with like exercising, standing, you have some sympathetic charge, or you've got a little bit of that sympathetic going on in your system. For the context of this practice, we're going to look at it as, when were there opportunities in your life that you can remember where you were in a sympathetic state? And I want you to list those out, write them down. So we're starting to create correlations between the way that you felt in sympathetic state, particular events that cued you into that you were in a sympathetic state. So again, we can start to create data and this kind of recognition of when we're in these different states. So then we can start to learn how we can move in and out of them, what informs us when we're in one state versus the other. And there's going to be some crossover of when we feel like we're in fight or flight, for example, with somebody else who feels like they're in fight or flight. So one common theme might be anger, right? Somebody might say, I really identify with anger being in a sympathetic. I'm really charged up. I'm really angry, right? Other times we don't always have that same similarity. So this is your unique map of what do you feel like defines your sympathetic state, your ventral state, and then we're going to go into dorsal. So take a moment and explore that sympathetic state. We're going to really start to get intimate with these three states. So pause this video if you want some other time to dig into that. We are going to look into dorsal. So dorsal state, you can also write parasympathetic. So this is kind of where it gets a little bit more complex. So there's two branches of the parasympathetic state from polyvagal theory. Is that we've got ventral up at the top, and then we've also got the dorsal branch down at the bottom. And we've got safety and connection in that ventral. And then here in dorsal, you can put shutdown or conservation. So this is the state of collapse. This is also where we rest and digest. So just like sympathetic, it's not, again, we're taking very complex things and distilling it into more practical application. So it's not necessarily that if we're in dorsal, we're absolutely in collapse and shutdown. It could just mean that we're sleeping. But in the context of this practice, we're going to start to define ways that we fall into dorsal in more of a protective sense. So, like the example of if somebody jumps out in front of you and you freeze, right? That's the freeze response. That's in a dorsal response where you're protective and you immobilize. So you're welcome to write that down under dorsal as well, is immobilization. So I'm kind of throwing out a bunch of different words to define these states in a general sense. Immobilization, shutdown, conservation, so that you can start to connect with the terminology that works best for you. Dorsal can be a little bit trickier for people to identify with if they haven't spent much time in dorsal. Dorsal is essentially where we just kind of blank out. Again, when I mentioned somebody jumping out at you and the mind goes blank, right? We just space out. Can sometimes be a characteristic of being in a dorsal state. A really simple example of it would be if you see an animal playing dead, right? So we can think about these states as a hierarchy. as we're in states of connection and safety up here. If we get triggered into threat, typically the next response is to fight or flee, right? It's this charge. Oh, there's something coming after me. And then if we can't get away, or if we can't fight the predator or the threat off, then we go into collapse. We go into shutdown mode and we pretend that we're immobilized. So hopefully the predator moves on. So I want you to get familiar with these 3 states for your practice. Okay? So we've got dorsal at the bottom, sympathetic and ventral, right? So you're going up and down these ladders and you're trying to identify the feelings, the situations, the expressions of when you're in each of these states for your individual map. And as you continue moving about your day, I want you to continue to compile data and try to note what informs you that you're in each of these states. And again, when we're looking at sympathetic and dorsal, we're looking at more in a protective sense rather than, oh, I'm exercising, I'm in sympathetic, which is great to know too. But essentially, we're looking more from that safety versus threat kind of perspective. So if you have any questions with this, of course, you are more than welcome to reach out, and I will see you for practice number 2.